think most of you, being German students in Oxford, have heard of the knight errant, probably, the noble character on a difficult quest in chivalric romance, who is also a popular trope in modern literature, in film, in video games, all sorts of things. Have you heard of the pilgrim errant, though? Today I will talk about that one, the pilgrim errant. Pilgrimage is a recurring theme in late medieval and early modern literature, so we will stay a little bit with the theological trajectory, but there will be a lot of entertainment, even though they don't cancel each other out. So pilgrimage is very popular in the era that we're going to look at today. One author who repeatedly treated pilgrims and pilgrimage in his works, spanning different genres and being quite popular with the audience, is the already aforementioned Georg or Jörg Wickram. In 1556, he published Der Reitend Pilger. If you wanted to translate this title in a maybe verbatim pedestrian way, it would amount to the pilgrim who rode errantly or wanderingly, but shorter works better, the pilgrim errant. This narrative, written in rhyming verse, tells the story of Arnold, a retired wealthy merchant who first becomes a grieving widower, then a humanist hermit, then a pilgrim, but a rather idiosyncratic kind of pilgrim. He mainly searches for his son, who has left their home to travel the world, but he's also searching for orientation and guidance in his own life. Towards the end of the text, Arnold enters a conversation with a learned abbot at a monastery. He gives an account of his life and his quest before asking the abbot for advice on how to proceed from there. He says, "Jetzund habt ihr mein ganzes Leben. Darauf ihr mir Bericht mögt geben, wie ich das weiter soll anheben." And the abbot replies, "Arnold, du hast gebeten mich, ich solle unterrichten dich, damit du Gott mögst gefällig sein. So merk auf, lieber Arnold mein, ich red mit dir als mit deinem Sohn, darum würde ich dich nicht nimm irzen nun. I will not irzen you anymore." Irzen, that's a kind of a strange expression, even to my ears. What the abbot is saying here is that he will stop addressing Arnold in the second person plural, using the pronoun ihr, which is what he has done up to this point in the story. Instead, he switches to du. Why does he do that? Why does Arnold not do the same? And which role do these pronouns play? These are some of the questions that I want to explore with you today, all summed up under the title question of how to speak to the pilgrim errant. To find an adequate answer, we need to equip us with linguistic and literary knowledge and go through several steps, which you see here. I'm basically pursuing two goals here. One is to speak about the forms of address in late medieval and early modern German. In doing that, I will introduce you to some concepts in historical linguistics. The main objective here is to discuss how historical linguistics can help us interpret historical literary texts. Connected to this objective is the second goal of my talk, which is to offer a glimpse into the discourse about pilgrimage in 16th century Germany. Wickram's Reitend Pilger is part of a larger tradition, and as I said earlier, he repeatedly treated this topic. So while for the most part of my lecture I will draw on the Reitend Pilger in the steps number 2 and 3 on the slide, later I will also discuss selected passages from his Rollwagenbüchlin that some of you already know and Henrike has already mentioned. And that's something like the German Canterbury Tales, if you permit me saying that. And this was a really immensely popular collection of stories in the 16th century. So this will be step 4 before I will close with a last section on current German. So who is Jörg Wickram? Wickram was active in the region around Colmar in Alsace in today's France, in the border area to what would today be the German federal state of Baden-Württemberg. Straßburg and Freiburg im Breisgau are close by. And Stuttgart, on the other side of the Black Forest, is not far away either. Wickram was the illegitimate son of Konrad Wickram from Colmar, who was a grocery merchant, a council member, a guild master, so he belonged to the upper class of the town of Colmar in this urban environment. But Wickram himself, being an illegitimate son, starts out on a somewhat lower status. Wickram, Jörg Wickram, the son, learned a trade and was possibly a goldsmith. What we know about him is not that much, but one assumes that he had a rudimentary school education. He probably went to a German school, but he claims that he doesn't know or knows little Latin. He did work on a translation from Ovid's Metamorphoses, but he had a German language intermediary. He did have several professional positions. For one, he was a council clerk, and he also was a town clerk, Stattschreiber in Burgheim, which you see here with the red pin on the map. In 1546, he inherits his father's house, so he gains citizens' rights as a Burger. So he sort of moves up the social ladder through his life. During his roughly 25 years of being an active writer and publisher, or publishing books, he was active in a broad range of contemporary genres. There were several plays, most of them at first in the genre of Fastnachtsspiel. He also wrote several Bible plays. There's one that is called Knabenspiegelspiel, a play about education or raising sons. He also probably was director of several drama performances, and maybe that's related to his function of town clerk. He did publish the Rollwagenbüchlin, which would be called a Schwanksammlung, a collection of tales. He also published a Losbuch, which is a satirical take on a divination book. He was active in the genre of dialogue. There is the Dialog von einem ungeratenen Sohn, so the topic of raising children here recurs. He might have engaged in working on a Flugblatt, but that's not completely certain. But he was important for the history of Meistergesang in the history of the German genre. He was involved in the Singschule, which is the institution where Meistergesang is done. And he was the one who bought the Kolmarer Liederhandschrift in Schlettstadt. So while there are no songs or poems that we know of that he wrote, he did engage in this sort of culture. In German literary history, he's most famous for his prose novels. He wrote several of them. Some that I've put here on the slide are Von guten und bösen Nachbarn. There's one called Goldfaden. Ritter Galmi is another one. They're not the only ones, though. And then there's the verse narrative of Reitend Pilger. Through Wickram's oeuvre, we get a fairly good overview of the main literary genres of the 16th century. In recent years, Wickram has gained recognition for the intermediate quality of his works, because many of his books were printed with extensive woodcut cycles, and some may even have been designed by himself. So my own work on Wickram's Bilger shares this interest in illustrated books and in the elaborate descriptions of images in the text. So it's not only the woodcuts, there's also a lot going on in terms of describing images and using rhetorics to evoke an image in the language. So when Arnold, the main character, and his traveling party arrive at the monastery, they are all invited to have breakfast with the convent. The printed edition of which you see the woodcut here on the right, illustrates this meal with a woodcut of the dining hall. You can see an indoor setting with the abbot presiding over the table on the center left, holding up a cup while a monk brings wine or beer in a large pitcher. Arnold, in pilgrim's dress with a wide-brimmed hat, sits in the center right. You can tell he's a pilgrim because of his dress, and you can compare it with the woodcut on the left here, which shows two variations, basically, of the iconography of pilgrims in this time. Next to Arnold, we can see his son Trudprecht, and on the left, between the monk and the abbot, we see a merchant who is part of their traveling company. Above the woodcut, in the printed edition, we would see a chapter title or an image caption announcing that Arnold wird am Tisch befragt von dem Abt, wie ver und wohin willen hab. In the main text, we learn the following. Als sie im besten Essen waren, kam der Abt an Arnold Quan, gar mit gütigen Worten lind. Er sagt, Arnold, mein lieber Freund, nit zürnen, dass ich euch tu fragen, ich bitt euch, wollt mir doch sagen, wohin ihr jetzt und willen hahnt, in welches Königreich oder Land. Arnold willingly replies by announcing that he and his son, Trudprecht, are on their way to the great pilgrimage sites of early modern Europe. Einsiedeln in the Black Forest, pretty close to Colmar and those cities there, but they also want to go to Santiago de Compostela and to Rome. Ehrwürdger Herr, mein Sinn und Gemüt staat mir noch fair, mit meinem Sohn zu reisen hin und wieder, wo ich hinkomm. Doch wer mein will, möchte es geschehen, zum ersten die Stadt Rom zu sehen, demnach ich wollt gon Compostell, suchen da selbst St. Jakobszell. Dazu wollte ich von Herzen gern hinein bis zu dem finstern Stern, Finisterre, also in Spain, not also in Spain. Demnach wollte ich mich wenden bald und ziehen nach dem finsteren Wald. So that's the Black Forest. The abbot, on hearing this, replies in a rather ambivalent way, I have to say, stating first that he would like to come with them and join their pilgrimage. However, if they were instead to stay with him for just a few days, he expects them to give up their plan. So bitte ich euch vor allen Dingen, ihr wollt ein klein warten auf mich, so will ich ein Gesellen geben ich und mit euch weilen solche Fahrt, wann uns der Weg nicht wird zu hart. Doch glaub ich, wann ihr nur 3 Tag warten auf mich und folgt meiner Sag, so werdet ihr euch bedenken, Bass. I want to make 2 points here. First of all, the abbot says, wait 3 days and you will think of something better than going on a pilgrimage. He spends large parts of the ensuing conversation warning about the dangers of going on a pilgrimage. You will get sick, villains will rob you or cheat you, pilgrimage sites hold nothing but badly sculpted statues eaten by woodworms. He says, ihr wisst, ein uralt Sprichwort ist, so näher Rom, so böser Christ. The closer you get to Rome, the worse or eviler a Christian will become. So stay away from Rome. This could be a little puzzling, couldn't it? A member of the clergy discourages a pilgrim and tries to persuade him not to continue his travels. Shouldn't he be the one to welcome this plan? That's a question we will deal with later. For the time being, let me make another point. Both Arnold and the abbot use the pronouns ihr and euch here, the plural form of pronominal address that is associated with politeness. This goes well with the nominal forms of address, compared to the pronominal forms of address, mein lieber Freund and ehrwürdiger Herr. They are not, as one says in German, per du. They don't address each other in the second person singular. This means that when the abbot later announces he will dich nimm erzen nu, that he will switch from ihr to du, this is a significant change that deserves investigation. So I just said that ihr signals politeness. In earlier periods of the German language, ihr works somewhat similar to sie with a capital S in modern German. You are probably aware of the distinction between du and sie in modern German. And if this was a lecture at a German university, I would address you using the Sie pronoun and your last name. Liebe Frau Müller, lieber Herr Meier, liebe Studierende, ich freue mich, dass Sie zu meiner Vorlesung gekommen sind. Lately, this is a little bit in flux, and some people are switching to Sie with first name plus last name, dropping the Herr, Frau title to achieve an inclusive form of address. So instead of, if it was addressed to me, liebe Frau Ratzke, it would be Guten Tag, Malena Ratzke. Guten Tag, instead of liebe, lieber, and then Malena, first name, Ratzke, last name. But traditionally, Sie and last name would be the customary form of address in formal situations, and university teaching is a somewhat formal situation in Germany. And this implies, on the one hand, a certain distance that goes with the hierarchy between students and lecturers in German academic culture. If you were a few years younger and I were a school teacher, you would also address me as Frau Ratzke, but I would address you, my pupils, on a first name basis and say du. In a university setting, however, we assume a different relationship, not least because students are adults, of course. So by using the Sie pronoun, I communicate my acknowledgement and respect for you as my students, as fully grown-up adults and members of the academic community. What we can take away from these scenarios are three observations. One, addressing people in the right way is about more than correct grammar. Addressing someone in a conversation has a social dimension. It tells us about social order and social roles, and the forms of address are part of navigating the relationship between you and your conversation partner. Second observation, the social aspect is acted out both in the names and titles we use, Herr, Frau, Doctor, Professor, Your Majesty, you name it, but also in the pronouns. Pronouns matter in this case. So let us look a little closer at these pronouns and their developments as forms of address. To understand this history in German, we need to take a step back and look at the history of German language. As you all know, the German language has not always sounded the same as today, and it changed over time. Linguistically, what we speak as a standard language today is called New High German. And Henrike already said, told me that you are already introduced or already know all about the terminology and the concepts of High German and Low German on the one hand. You're probably also familiar with the linguistic periods of High German, but I'm taking a few seconds to look at them here. The figure that you see here is taken from Howard and Martin Jones's Oxford Guide to Middle High German. Old and Middle High German are the periods of German between 750 AD, or CE, Common Era, and 1350. This overlaps for a large part with the cultural and literary periods of the Middle Ages. This is also true for the 14th and 15th centuries, but linguistically, between 1350 and 1650, we speak of early New High German. This is the time of Wickram and the Reitend Bilger. So we will come back to that in a bit. Then, as you can see in the figure, linguists call everything that is younger than the 17th century New High German. So, by the standards of historical linguistics, Goethe, Dorothea Schlegel, Brecht, Christa Wolf, and contemporary authors from the past 5 years all belong to the same period of German language history. Now, in the times before German as a language even existed, in the Germanic dialects from which German evolved, there was only one pronoun for addressing another person, the equivalent of du. Old and Middle High German expand this to two options, du and ihr. Jones and Jones tell us that grammatically du is singular and ihr is plural, but ihr is often found in Middle High German works as a polite form for a single addressee. Within families, parents address children with du, while children may use either du or ihr in addressing their parents. Among adults, in general, du is used for addressees of low social standing and ihr for those of high social standing. Thus, ihr is the typical form of address in courtly literature, even between spouses. So literature sometimes does different things than everyday communication. By stating that children may use either du or ihr in addressing their parents, Jones and Jones highlight the fact that age and hierarchy, both aspects of social order, play a big role in choosing between the available options. Aspects like these can be summed up under the rubric of politeness. As with all conventions, speakers can choose to break the rules and to achieve a special effect by breaking the rules, or by explicitly addressing the rules too. Literature especially can play with these rules in an artful way. Among people of high social standing who might normally address each other using ihr, the more personal du can signal a certain intimacy between them. Offering to switch from one option to the other can signify a change in the relationship, for instance, the beginning of a friendship or of an alliance. In German society today, jemandem das Du anbieten, the title of the slide, to offer someone to say du is a powerful ritual between work colleagues, business partners, and this also existed in Middle High German around the year 1200. In Wolframs von Eschenbach Parzival, the character Feirefitz, who is Parzival's half-brother, but they only get to know each other fairly late in their lives, Feirefitz acts according to custom when he asks politely, dass irzens inhalierse und in dusen hierse, to permit him to move beyond ihr and call him du. In contrast, using du in a situation where ihr would be expected can be a method of deliberately disrespecting the other person. And I will come back to yet another option of disrespect at the end of my lecture. So the system expanded from du to du plus ihr. Horst Simon published the figure in the bottom right here, visualizing the progression of pronouns of address over time. CG stands for Common Germanic, OHG and MHG for Old and Middle High German, and MSG is for Modern Standard German. As you can see here, starting in the 17th century, there is an increasing amount of variety. As Simon puts it, over the course of time, more and more pronouns enter into the system, each of them more polite than the previous one, but none of them ousting the ones already there. Thus, the inventory of forms gradually expands and becomes relatively large by the 18th century. This gradual expansion reaches almost satirical dimensions by the time of Goethe and Schiller in the 18th century. At this time, Johann Christoph Adelung pursues his grammatical and lexicographical research, which was highly influential for the history of linguistics. In 1782, in his grammar handbook Umständliches Lehrgebäude der deutschen Sprache, he portrays the forms of address in what I find is a rather entertaining way. I quote, Es wird du nur noch erstens gegen Gott, zweitens in der Dichtkunst und dichterischen Schreibart, drittens in der Sprache der engen Vertraulichkeit und viertens in dem Throne der hochgebietenden Herrschaft und tiefen Verachtung gebraucht. Außer diesen Fällen redet man sehr geringe Personen mit ihr, etwas bessere mit er und sie, noch bessere mit dem Plural sie und noch vornehmere wohl mit dem Demonstrativo dieselben oder auch mit abstrakten Würdenamen Eure Majestät, Eure Durchlaucht, Eure Exzellenz und so fort an. Adelung shows how German piles layer upon layer of politeness on top of the original du. When he distinguishes sehr geringe Personen, etwas bessere, noch bessere und noch vornehmere. Analyzing the system grammatically, the expansion follows two basic principles of politeness. Nübling and co-authors speak of the metaphor Vielzahl steht für Macht. Many are more powerful than one. This has been called powerful as plural, but I like the translation strength in numbers because that's already an idiomatic expression. So this is a strategy of positive politeness. I address the other person as if they were more powerful than I am, no matter what is actually the case. On the other hand, the principle of negative politeness is at play. By addressing the addressee indirectly, I act as if they were part of a group without singling them out as an individual. They can decide how close they want to approach or how much they want to withdraw. This is why German speakers started using er and sie as pronouns of address. It seems like this wasn't enough to represent the intricate hierarchies of early modern society, though. So German developed another pronoun, sie with a capital S, the one that you know today. While the number of categories further increased, the step was actually achieved by simply using the same rule, from the third person singular to the third person plural. For a variety of reasons, pragmatically and sociologically, this complex system basically imploded over the course of the 19th century. What remained are the two extremes, basic du and polite sie, which is the system we still have today. All right, so now we have gone through the history of pronominal forms of address, and now we can try and answer the question from the beginning of my talk and interpret the dialogue between Arnold and the abbot. Der Reitend Pilger was first published in 1556. So historically, we would expect the two pronouns du as the unmarked normal form and ihr as the polite form. When Arnold says, jetzt und habt ihr mein ganzes Leben, darauf ihr mir Bericht mögt geben, he abides by the rules of positive politeness, strength in numbers, and negative politeness. He addresses the abbot only indirectly, leaving him the option to withdraw. The abbot now, he deviates from the custom. Arnold, du hast gebeten mich, ich solle unterrichten dich, damit du mögst Gott gefällig sein. So merk auf, lieber Arnold mein, ich red mit dir als einem Sohn, drum würd ich dich nimm jetzt nun. Although up to this point, the abbot has used the ihr pronoun. Here, he not only switches to du, but marks this as unusual. Since he stops using the polite pronoun, we may get the impression that he wants to show him disrespect. It may be even somewhat condescending, given the whole son thing that's going on here. So has their relationship taken a wrong turn somewhere, might be the question that we ask. The clue lies in the announcement, merk auf, lieber Arnold mein. Ich red mit dir als mit einem Sohn. The abbot uses the rules in the reverse way. If ihr signals politeness, du can signal closeness and intimacy. The abbot assumes the role of a well-meaning father, teaching his son about the important things in life. Assuming this role in front of a wealthy, accomplished merchant, who's probably somewhere in his 60s age-wise, is actually a risky thing to do. And it could be interpreted as being condescending, as a condescending gesture, which is why he, the abbot, marks his deviation explicitly by saying, merk auf, now listen. All of this are markers and signals that tell us that what comes next will be important in the narrative. And we really have arrived at a central crossroads in the narrative here. The main question of the text, Der Reitend Pilger, is how to live a good life as a layperson. Arnold, the widower merchant, is torn between the road and his home, between the world and the religious, between a worldly life and the need for spiritual orientation. And the abbot is one of the characters who he meets over the course of the story, someone who engages in conversation about these topics with him. And the Reitend Pilger discusses different models as options for leading the good life everyone seeks in the 16th century, or should be seeking. He meets a learned farmer, sort of a contradiction in terms, a sinful priest, another contradiction, and a friendly robber baron. So in this passage in the monastery, Arnold gives an account of his life, and he explains how it came about that he left his comfortable garden villa / hermitage at the outskirts of the town to go on his Reitend odyssey. It is because his son Trudprecht left him to see the world. But after a while, Arnold realizes that he really can't live without a son, and he worries so much that he must leave his hermitage too and find his son. Arnold says, zu reiten was mir also gach, dass ich meinem Sohn möcht kommen nach, kam erstlich auf die rechte Straß, die auch selbst geritten war, mocht aber nie erreiten ihn, bis, dass ich dahin kommen bin, da ich von Räubern ward gefangen. Arnold's quest does not last longer than 3 days before he gets abducted and held for ransom by a Raubritter, the robber baron that I already mentioned. Fortunate for Arnold, his son Trudprecht was also abducted by this Raubritter. So they're reunited again and are free just a little later. Arnold speaks here of die rechte Straß, the right path, which has a double function here. Because in a literal sense, this does denote the route Arnold's son Trudprecht has taken. At the same time, the expression die rechte Straß evokes a metaphorical or allegorical connotation, referring to the idea of standing in bivio at the crossroads of life, having to decide between virtue and sin, good and evil, deciding which path to follow. The abbot plays a decisive role in this situation. For the remainder of their conversation in the monastery's garden, they discuss the important ideas of Christianity. The abbot teaches Arnold about the basics of Christian faith, instructing him how to lead a religious life while staying in the world. The main message here is, you are a lay person, you don't need to withdraw from the world completely. You work on becoming a good Christian in everyday life. This also means don't run from your problems, don't try to fix your life by going on a short-term pilgrimage. Looking back at the plot of the Reitend Pilger from this vantage point, we gather that the whole pilger thing is a metaphor for life. Arnold never even comes close to any of the pilgrim sites he says he wants to see. However, he learns a lot on the way by talking to the people he meets, and in the end, he and Trudprecht can return home safely. The abbot's depiction of pilgrimage as a dangerous and useless endeavor belongs to an established discussion about pilgrimage, veneration of the saints, and church criticism in the 15th and 16th centuries. It starts well before the Reformation and continues on both sides of the confessional divide all through the 16th century. Wickram takes part in this debate without taking a confessional side. From his works, we don't really know whether he was a Catholic or a Protestant and what kind of Protestant this would be. He sort of leaves things open, partly probably because that way he can sell his books to all kinds of people rather than one confession. He does repeatedly talk about pilgrimage. This seems to be a special topic for him. Wickram's Rollwagenbüchlin was published in 1555, so that's 1 year before the Reitend Pilger. It's really Wickram's bestseller, with extended editions appearing almost immediately. The title page you see here is from 1557, and there's 17 editions published in total until well into the 17th century. The book is a collection of first 67, later up to 110 tales that are called schwencke in German. And that's a term which denotes a short tale of a usually comical character, often taking a surprising turn, the schwank, to make a comical or moral point. I will read out the rather long title to you. Das Rollwagenbüchlein. Ein neues vnerhörts Büchlein, darin viel gůter, schwencke und Historien begriffen werden, welche man in Schiffen und auf den Rollwägen erzählen mag. Die schweren, melancholischen Gemüter damit zu ermuntern. Allen Kaufleuten, so die Messen hin und wieder brauchen, zu einer Kurzweil an Tag bracht und wiederum erneuert und gemehrt durch Jörg Wickrammen. If we compare this with the frame narrative in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, you probably immediately notice certain parallels. Stories to be told on a journey, with the aim of shortening the time and enjoying oneself. Note how Wickram highlights Kurzweil, pastime, as the main purpose here. Even though most of the tales do have a didactic component, they are explicitly meant to provide entertainment. The Rollwagenbüchlein does not have a proper frame narrative like the Canterbury Tales, so we don't have the actual traveling party assembling at some point and going off. But there are two dedication letters which frame the perception for the reader. One is to a patron and another addressed to the reader. I will limit myself to the first one, to Martin Neuen or Neu, who is addressed as the landlord of the Colmar Tavern zu der Blumen. And it begins rather impressively. Dem ehrsamen, fürnehmen und achtbaren Martin Neuen, Burger und Wirt zu der Blumen zu Colmar, meinem insonders günstigen Herren und guten Freund. The sheer number of adjectives and titles gives away that Wickram really wants to pay reverence to this friend, to whom he presents his book in gratitude for various good deeds he has received. Wickram has tailored this book to this landlord's professional obligation to hospitality, to socialize with customers, an obligation he may fulfill by engaging in conversation and telling tales and jokes. Since all of you are part of college life and of formals and all that, I'm sure you can relate to this, and maybe some of the stories come in handy at some point. The dedication letter goes on, after a short section that deals with other stuff. Dieweil nun männiglich weist, geistlich und weltlich Fürsten und Herren, die dann täglich ihren Aufritt und Herberg bei euch haben, dass ihr mit guten Schwenken und kurzweiligen Bossen zu jeder Zeit und je nachdem die Person ist, gefasst sind, habe ich euch zur Wiedergeltung eurer Guttat dies mein klein Werklein zu Gefallen an Tag geben. So, dann ist auch in eurem Gebrauch, alle Straßburger Mess einen eigenen Rollwagen anzurichten. Alsdann haben wir euch zusammt guten Herren und Freunden mit diesem Büchlin zu ergetzen, dieweil ihr auf der Fahrt sind, welches auch vormänniglich ohne allen Anstoß mag gelesen werden. The syntax here is really complicated, but the most important parts will become clear. Martin Neu's patrons are members of the early modern upper class, geistlich und weltlich Fürsten und Herren, as well as merchants who travel to fairs with the Rollwagen. Rollwagen is the 16th century equivalent of a shuttle bus, I would say, and Martin Neu seems to run something like a bus touring company during the fair season. You may notice that although Wickram considers him a good friend, there is no duzen here. He uses the polite pronouns of ihr and euch. While in Chaucer's frame narrative, the travelers set out to go on a religious pilgrimage, Wickram's setting is more of a secular character. On the title page, he talks about ships and coaches, hairdressers and barbershops, public bathhouses, and merchants traveling to the fair. Pilgrimage is not on the title page and not in the dedication letter. However, it does recur as a topic. In fact, the first tale tells of a pilgrim who betrays a rather dim-witted farmer bearing the title, as you can see here, wie ein gut fromm Mann am Kochersberg, einem guten, einfaltigen, ein Wallfahrt verdinget, zu Sandfeiten zu wallen. It starts by addressing the frame setting of telling stories on the road. Dieweil wir jetzt und auch auf einer Fahrt oder Reis sind, so mahnet mich gleich ein guter Schwank, dass ich euch denselbigen erzähl. Again, the form of address chosen here is ihr, euch, but we can assume a group setting, so it does not necessarily reveal anything about the register of politeness. The story proper then only uses du pronouns. We hear about a pious farmer who, after recovering from a serious illness, pledges a pilgrimage to St. Veit, Vitus, one of the 14 holy helpers. But because the farmer is swamped with work in the fields, he decides to get someone else to go on the pilgrimage for him. I quote, also fand einen nach seinem Gefallen, denselbigen fertigt ab mit Opfer, Wachs und einem guten feisten Hahnen, dies alles befahl ihm, Sandfeiten zu bringen. An offering of money, wax for votive candles, and a chicken. So the pilgrim subcontractor goes off on his way to the place of pilgrimage, only to discover that the monastery dedicated to St. Vitus is far up the steep mountain. What the pilgrim lacks in fitness, he makes up in cunning. And so he decides to stop at another monastery on the way, which has All Saints as patrons. As the porter opens the gate, the pilgrim asks, Lieber, sind nicht Allheiligen da inne? Der Portner sagt eilends ja. Danach hat den feisten Hahn bei ihm ersehen und meint, er wollte ihn allen Heiligen bringen zu einem Opfer. Lieber Portner, sagt der Waller. Waller is another term for a pilgrim. Gang hinein zu allen Heiligen und heiß mir nur seinen Feiten herauskommen, dann ich hab Geld und diesen Hahn so ihm zugehören. The comical effect results from the pilgrims taking the patronage literally, acting as if the saints were living and sort of moving about in the monastery, like regular people would. Certainly, Allheiligen, All Saints, must include Saint Vitus as well, right? Let him come to the front door so he will receive his offering. The poor porter does not understand and gets angry, upon which the pilgrim decides to just leave without handing over the sacrifice. And he shouts, in going away, so behalt du dir deine Allheiligen, so will ich St. Veiten behalten. Upon returning to the farmer, his boss in this kind of thing, he pretends to have fulfilled his duty and gets paid. The text says, der gut Waller was wohl content, denn hat 3 Schanzen mit einer Karten gewonnen. He scored 3 wins with 1 playing card. Unusual for the Rollwagenbüchlin, Wickram adds an epimytion, a moralizing conclusion to this tale. Here, he criticizes the veneration of saints and intercession, the idea that saints can support a cause in front of God. He also criticizes the notion of delegating one's own good deeds to be performed by someone else. Everyone must work for their own salvation. Thirdly, Wickram criticizes the common practice of giving sacrifices to saints. I quote, gut feist Hennen, Hahnen und Kapaunen, wem aber die zu Trost kommen, weiß Gott wohl. Dann die geschnitzten und gemalten Heiligen haben sie nicht genossen. It's not the sculpted or painted saints who will have feasted on the meat. Before I close, I would like to take another look at the present. I mentioned along the way that forms of address are currently changing, that we see non-binary inclusive forms of formal address emerge. Another change we observe is an increase of the colloquial du in contexts that are considered formal. People are quicker to offer the du, jemandem das du anbieten, in a professional environment. For decades, IKEA has been addressing their customers in the second person singular because this is an essential feature of their brand in their German marketing. Because Swedish, being a Swedish company, does not distinguish between different pronouns of address. Does this mean that the polite Sie or even politeness itself will disappear from the German language? I don't know, but I'm really interested in seeing how things will develop, and I leave that for others to investigate. Instead, I would like to discuss evidence from literature and film, which suggests that artists start playing with the customs of politeness within the confines of duzen. Heinz Strunk, author of novels like Fleisch ist mein Gemüse, Der goldene Handschuh, and member of the group Studio Braun, had a regular column in the satirical magazine Titanic. Strunk is a master of minute observation when it comes to the language of certain milieus of German society. He also has a penchant for stereotypical idioms and really bad jokes. In a column from 2020, he wrote, and you can read this on the slide, 10.11. Geilen Spruch aufgeschnappt. Wenn man eine Nervensäge loswerden möchte, darf ich dir das Tschüss anbieten. Einfach witzig. A Nervensäge, for those of you who don't know the term, is a person who is a real pain in the neck. If you want to get rid of someone like that, ask them, may I offer you the goodbye? Playing on the highly formalized darf ich Ihnen das Du anbieten, the question follows the rulebook of old-fashioned politeness. However, these rules are harshly broken by offering the Tschüss, terminating the conversation. It's an affront in the disguise of politeness and therefore quite rude. Strunk is obviously fascinated with this effect. He puts it to good use in his most recent work, Last Exit Schinkenstraße. This miniseries portrays Peter and Torben. You will see Tom in the subtitles soon. That's not right, Torben. Two aging, down-and-out musicians who attempt to get back on their feet. They write extremely obnoxious party songs for the German-dominated nightlife scene of Mallorca, the one that goes by the name of Ballermann. With a little bit of generous stretching of the concept, you might call this a modern take of travel literature. A succession of gags replacing the schwank, and maybe the charter flight to Mallorca taking the place of the early modern Rollwagen. I'm not sure about that, but you'll have to see for yourself. I'm only going to show you one of the major scenes that starts out of this, where they surprisingly get kicked out of their own band by band leader Manni. Being musicians and having played together for 20 years, Manni, Peter, and Torben are of course on a first-name basis. When Manni tells them he doesn't want them in the band anymore, he enforces the brutality of the situation by parodistically quoting the level of politeness that is conveyed by darf ich Ihnen das Du anbieten. The clip we're going to show you is about 1.5 minutes, so I hope you'll enjoy it.